So a word of introduction before we begin. I'm, as Katie mentioned, Clint Schnekloth. I'm a pastor in Fayetteville, Arkansas, which is the northwestern part of the state of Arkansas. It's the university town, and we're probably most famous in our area for the largest corporation in the world, Walmart, the largest protein distributor in the world, Tyson Foods, and there's a few other things around our region that are relatively well known. But I also know from having been in D.C. a few times, as one of the gentlemen in the pews here mentioned, you don't meet that many people from Arkansas in D.C. So, maybe I'm the ombudsman for the state. I'm not originally from Arkansas. I'm in Iowa, born and raised on a farm in Iowa, and then have lived in a variety of places, but really glad to be here with you today, and really thankful for the invitation. Your pastor invited us to come and be here to preach while he was on sabbatical, making arrangements for kind of a preaching schedule, I understand, maybe through the summer, is that right? And so we're staying here at his, or at your parsonage, and it's been really a blessing for our family, so I'm here with my whole family. They also chose to attend the 10 o'clock service, so that was the choice of the morning. So, quick question for you. I need a show of hands. Raise your hand if you are currently alienated from a relative of yours. Okay. Now raise your hand if you know a person who's alienated from a relative of theirs. Right? Okay. Now keep those hands up for a second. How many of those that you currently have your hands up are alienated from a relative because of Jesus? Keep your hand up. Okay. So to be really clear at the beginning of this message, when Jesus says that he's come to turn father against son or daughter against sister-in-law or any of those relative relations that he's talking about, he means something very specific. If you're just being a jerk, you should say sorry and get over it. If your family member has some kind of like borderline personality disorder, read Walking on Eggshells. It's a very good book. If you feel like you're walking on eggshells around somebody, that's a very good resource. But he's not talking about general forms of alienation in this text, right? He's talking about a specific kind of alienation from relatives and why you would be alienated from them. And I'm going to come back around to that in a little bit. But first I have to be maybe a little more direct and concrete. And by that I'll have to tell a story. So this is my 5th visit, I think, to D.C. in my lifetime. We're here for 2 weeks, and we're going to go up to New York for a little bit after church today, spend some time with another pastor friend up there, and come back down. We've been here for a few days. We're going to be here for a whole week when we get back. And while I'm here, even though this time I'm on vacation, I can't help but think about the proximity of it all. I mean, I imagine you live with this all of the time because this is where you live, right? But literally, the first day that we were here, I walked just right over to the Rayburn building and went into my congressman's office, and then they gave us the tour, of the Capitol. And the last time I was here, which was just a couple of months ago, it was actually partially due to the hospitality of this congregation. I was here with a delegation from Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, and we were going to advocate for refugees and immigrants with our senators and representatives. And this is what's fun about this, okay? There are 20 ELCA churches in the whole state of Arkansas. 20. I think you have like 9 in D.C. or something, right? So you maybe have more than that. I don't even know. I went to college at Luther College, which is where Michael went, I think. Decorah, Iowa, 10,000 people, has 20 ELCA churches, right? So scale is a big deal. So I came as the Lutheran presence, pastoral presence from the entire state of Arkansas to advocate in front of Tom Cotton and John Bozeman about immigration and refugee resettlement, made all the more poignant, of course, by the fact that our president had just a couple of months earlier issued an executive order that impacted, famously in the news, it impacted travel, but less well known, but very impactful to the work that we do in Arkansas, it was a stop on refugee resettlement, if it would have followed through. And a whole bunch of nonprofits that do refugee resettlement work were literally imperiled. You know, it's like the analogy I gave to people at the time who didn't understand, well, why can't there be a pause? Be like, what if you owned a restaurant and I told you that you needed to take a 120-day pause from serving food while we figure out what's going on in your kitchen? You know, we know what would happen, right? It would be very, very hard for you to survive that. Well, nonprofits are the same thing. So we came up here with representation from across the ELCA, plus representation from Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service in Baltimore, and you provided the hospitality. We had lunch here. We could come and cool off between sessions, depending on how our sessions went, and it was really nice. So thank you. So it's hard for me coming here to not disambiguate that. It's like, here you are. I know you're just a regular old congregation in Washington, D.C., and you just happen to be located right next to the capital of the United States of America, right? That's the deal. Well, the last time I was here, before that, I was here marching to protest our invasion of Iraq. Rode on a bus with a bunch of people from Madison, Wisconsin. That didn't work out very well. We went in anyway, so my sign holding didn't turn out well. And the time before that, I was a seminarian. I lived up at by Catholic University and took classes at Howard Divinity School and Catholic. And I never came to this church. I went to Luther Place. I went to a Catholic parish up by where I lived. And I spent a lot of time in DuPont Circle. I loved it. It's a great little neighborhood. So I didn't know this neighborhood as well. And then the first time I was here, and this is all just fun, I think fun context for you so you can get a sense of how people think about the city a little bit who come from other places. When I was 9, so closer to your age. The company DuPont was doing a photo shoot. They wanted to make like wall hangings and placemats and other stuff about a typical farm family in the United States. And my uncle happened to work for DuPont in the right department at that time, and we fit the bill. Older son, younger daughter, 4 people on a farm. And so they flew us into D.C. for this photo shoot, and they put us up in front of all the food we would eat in a year, which was really wild to look at. Like they had lined up, there was like green beans and cans, and then hanging up on hooks were like salmon and a whole like half of a steer and other things all lined up. And they took this big photo of us, and then we got a tour of D.C. So that loomed really large in my mind. So all of this is context for you to understand that you're sitting, whether you like it or not, and you already know this, I feel like I'm saying what you already know, you're sitting at this center of something, right? Now, this is where this gets tricky. So this is what Jesus is saying in this text to you. You don't get to be off the hook. You just don't. Like, discipleship is an expectation regardless of where you are, and regardless of how hard it is, and regardless of how many relationships might get alienated because you pursue discipleship. So he starts the teaching by saying this pretty interesting thing. He says, you don't have to be me exactly, you just have to be like me. Right? You don't have to be more Jesus-y than Jesus. You just have to be kind of like Jesus. And what I worry about is that we interpret this text as if what it's saying is you don't really have to be like Jesus because nobody can be like Jesus. And Jesus doesn't teach that, actually. What Jesus teaches throughout the entire Gospel of Matthew, the concept of discipleship that's in the whole Gospel of Matthew, is that the discipling community can be like Jesus. And since it can be, it has to. You should be like Jesus. You shouldn't try to be above the master. You shouldn't try to be above the teacher, but you should be as much like the teacher and as much like the master as you possibly can. So that's the first thing that he teaches. He lays that out there. And then he says that fascinating thing. So it's like, okay, you ought to be like me. And if you're like me, there's always guilt by association. So if you look like me and act like me, then people will assume you are part of the movement that I'm leading. And because you're part of the movement that I'm leading, and then he gives the weird example. So if you go following Beelzebul, people are going to assume that you're like Beelzebul, right? If you put on a black mask like Darth Vader and try to act like Darth Vader, people will assume you're part of the movement that Darth Vader leads, right? I mean, this is just the way this works. And so then he says to the discipling community, you should expect that if you follow me and you try to be like me, that people are going to treat you the same way they treat me. And the way that will work out, the way that will play out, is you will be centered in something different if you really follow Jesus than what the people who are closest to you are used to you being centered in. Now let's go back to your family alienation thing, right? So this is what happens in families where people get alienated from one another. What a lot of people want to do, especially emotionally manipulative people, is they want to control how you act, and the way they do that is they react to your actions. And then they hope that your actions will modify so that you don't get those reactions from them, right? This is how manipulation works. And so, if you say to your family member, I would really like to go see Cars 3. And they say, that's a terrible movie. We're not going to go see that. And you say, and you never have said this before, well, I want to see it, so I'm just going to go see it. What are they going to do? They're going to ramp up their behavior. They're going to say about how it's immoral and it's bankrolling some corrupt industry, whatever. They're going to keep ramping it up to try to control And if you stay centered and you just say, I want to see that movie, and I'm just going to go see it. It's nothing about you, nothing against you, but I'm going to go see that movie. And then they're alienated from you. That's not about Jesus, but you still were being very good and self-centered. I'm just going to do that. I can't change your behavior. I can't change your reaction, right? But I can act differently for myself. Now apply this to Jesus. The whole culture around us, and in particular, the people closest to us, are going to be made uncomfortable if we start acting more like Jesus. That's just going to happen. The more you act like Jesus, the more some people in your life are going to be made incredibly uncomfortable. And at that point, you have a choice. Will you react to their reactivity and say, okay, if this is going to alienate me from my dad, then I'm just not going to act like Jesus. I'm just going to go back to doing stuff other than following Jesus because my dad will like it better if I don't act like Jesus. Or will you say to your dad, at some risk probably, you know what? Ultimately, my Lord is not your reaction to me, but Jesus. And so if you're going to act like this, I don't think you should act like this. I wish you wouldn't, but if you're gonna, I have to follow Jesus. And then he ramps it up, and right, you've had these you know what these dialogues are like. You've seen some markers of them, the emotional manipulation that goes on, until Dad finally says to you, well, you're no son of mine then, right? And then you end up in the actual biblical passage that we have before us. That can happen. That really can happen. In fact, if you're following Jesus, it will happen. And the same goes true for being in a context like this, right? So I'm just guessing, and you tell me later if I'm completely wrong about this, but I'm guessing that you maybe have had dialogues at this church that have gone, well, we can't be about everything over there because we're like right here and we just kind of have to be in the neighborhood, right? Is this right? So how often has the Lutheran Church of the Reformation led the charge on X, Y, or Z things that have to do with making sure that our nation tries to emulate the values of Jesus? Has it? Does it? Does it meet resistance when it does? Have you lost members before because the church has said, we're going to do this regardless of the cost, right? I mean, I don't know any of the examples. I'd love to learn some of them from you. But I think those are all risks that happen when you actually go that direction, right? And so then now you have a text that's a resource for those moments, right? You don't want to be a jerk about it. So churches that just split and have people leave because they're just being like obstinate or too on point or whatever, that's one thing. But if you have people leave because you became self-centered enough as a congregation and you listened to Jesus enough that you could say to yourselves as a congregation, we're really being like Jesus here. And then people say, sorry, I can't be a part of that. Right? This is the text. This is the text. And then Jesus says all these consoling things in the midst of that. You know, that you're of more value than a sparrow. That God will bring things into the light that are in darkness. That you're not going to be lost. That you don't need to be afraid. All of those words of consolation are spoken, but they're not spoken preemptively before you take the risk of following Jesus. They're spoken to the community of people who's actually following Jesus and taking the risk. Those are who the words are for, right? Okay, so now sit with this. I'm going to come back next week. We're going to keep going on this because unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the Gospel of Matthew continues throughout the rest of the summer. So get ready, like it's a ride, right? I'm going to hear stories this morning, hopefully a little bit from some of you, that'll help put some of this in context, and we'll continue with it next week. And thank you again for the hospitality and the opportunity to be with you today.